Welcome to Mission Undercover. Joining me today is Ramon Perez, Director of the Digital Democracy Project. We are going to discuss how we can radically reshape our politics, and we're going to also discuss the state of our politics and society today. Could you start by introducing yourself and outlining what your political views are? Like, where do you stand on the major issues that we face today?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's good to be on the show. And Digital Democracy Project, the concept is that we actually don't take a political position. We provide a platform so that voters can choose their own political position and let their legislators know how they want them to vote on all the bills that are being considered in Congress. And we use mobile voting software that's being used in the United States and Canada and Mexico and in a couple of other countries, European countries that are experimenting with this, where we people can be verified against the voter file and against a photo ID that matches their face using a selfie scan, and that has pretty serious encryption technology, homomorphic encryption, uses a blockchain backend. So there's a lot of security apparatus built around this to make certain that the vote that's cast is the vote that's counted, so that it's not an online poll, like a Twitter poll, which is all filled with bots, or um, it's protected against deep fakes and things like this. But what it does is we allow people to see each of the bills that are being debated in Congress and read the legislation. We provide an AI generated summary of the legislation as well, so that easier for them to understand what the bill does and how it impacts their communities. And then we give them the opportunity to have their say, so they can let their legislator know how they want them to vote. And because we've matched them on the voter file, we know which district they're assigned to and which congressman is representing their district. The congressman can see how their district want them to vote on a basically a map that we continuously update as the debate happens in Congress, so that actually anyone can see. It's not, everything on our platform is public and it's transparent. We're a nonprofit organization, so we do this as a public service. So legislators, journalists, other members of your community, everybody can see how everybody stands on a given piece of legislation. So, for example, the Iran War Powers Resolution was an important bill that was being debated in Congress. The funding for the Department of Homeland Security, the One Big Beautiful Bill was another, marquee legislation that we carried. We give people a chance to get informed and educated about the bill and then form their own opinion. But then at the end of every legislative session, we compare what did the voters want in the versus how did the legislator actually perform when they voted in the floor in Congress, so that everyone gets a score, and that scorecard is over the course of hundreds of bills over the course of years. You really get a sense of whether or not a given representative is actually doing the job that they were sent to Washington to do. Are they representing their districts, or are they not? And should a challenger be given a chance to do a better job? And we've got some concrete data to work with. So that's the basic premise of what we're trying to provide.
So, do you think something like this can be replicated elsewhere? Because we are seeing a big problem of political disengagement, and that's leading to the rise of extreme forces like Reform UK here and Trump in America. And people feel like politics can't change their lives, that it doesn't work for their communities, and they feel disempowered. So, this is a
hmm
really good way of giving power back to people's communities and allowing them to actually understand what's going on and have influence over their decisions. But do you think that this can be part of a model of direct democracy that gives real power to communities to make decisions?
That's exactly right. And I lived in London for 4 years. I've always had it in my head that this was an international concept, really because we see these forces everywhere, as you point out. It's a global phenomenon because we are in an information economy where we get an immense amount of additional information, but it's very difficult to sift through what is true and what is not. And we also feel this great sense of being disempowered by our politics because of the many layers that stand between us and our government. in the United States, we have this constant problem with a political class that has feels like it's been bought by powerful interests, by the political parties, by the lobbying groups, by special interests, by the billionaire donor class. We've sort of turned political corruption into the standard of the day. And so there's this tremendous sense that people feel like they're no longer being listened to, and that can manifest itself in the form of these more extreme groups because they're seen as just a way to kick the political elite in the teeth, regardless of what they stand for. They're almost seen as a way to just burn the system down. And I think what we're trying to do is provide a way to rebuild the system up and do it on the basis of giving everyone a say in a process so that you don't have to storm the Capitol, or you don't have to go and I forget when I was there, it was Extinction Rebellion, right? Was laying on the ground in front of Parliament. You don't have to do these extreme physical protests to put your body on the line if you can just have a say in the process using this form of participatory democracy.
It also shows that whilst mainstream politicians have had some success, like Biden and Starmer, they haven't been able to communicate that success. And so communities haven't felt the difference in their lives because they still feel like their politicians have done nothing for them. And something like this would really connect politicians back with the people and allow them to serve people's priorities rather than corporate priorities. But do you think it's actually possible to build a system that has limits on the power of lobbyists and political donations? Can we actually have a system that functions without political donations? Because state funding is seen as something that's not really viable and it has its own problems as well.
Right, that's a great point, and I think in the UK you can get some. If you're talking specifically about campaigns, there is the concept of public funding for campaigns that we don't really have in the United States. So I think that if you could imagine a future where legislators just govern with the direct intent of their districts all the time, theoretically you wouldn't even need to campaign. You would just be graded on your performance using these kinds of scorecards, right? It would be, I was sent to Washington to do this job. I'm being measured by how well I do the job. I don't need to spend a ton, millions of dollars on telling people how great I am or what I'm going to do next, or tearing down my opponent. So participatory democracy in many ways, it cuts out all the middlemen. Like so many great technologies, I think that what mobile voting and what AI are going to do for democracy is that they reduce transaction costs, which campaigns are one of the tremendous transaction costs in our election process. They reduce information asymmetry, which is, I think, one of the best parts about what AI is going to give us is that we can rapidly read and summarize and digest this complex legislation in a way that's very easy to understand. And they directly connect buyers and sellers in a market. If you think about what Uber's done and what Airbnb has done, we're trying to do exactly the same thing. The buyer is the voter, and the seller is the legislator, and there are so many middlemen in that process that we could cut out by directly connecting the voter and their representative. So I think that this technology gives us an opportunity to really rethink the elections process from soup to nuts.
It's really interesting because currently we measure success based on this measure of GDP, which doesn't really show how communities are actually affected by the decisions that politicians make. So, if we are to have a radically different system, we also need a radically different way of measuring success within that system. And I think that what you were saying about having dashboards or scoreboards of what impact policies are having on people's communities would be really helpful. But also, we shouldn't be basing everything on one narrow measure. We should be looking at a range of measures that reflect the range of different priorities that our political process has. So, my next question is, should policy making be more evidence based or should it be more ideological? Because I do recognize that ideology has a big role to play to set the political vision and political direction of a government. But at the same time, it feels like the the decisions that politicians take are detached from reality.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. I mean, when the concept of GDP or gross national product, I think at the time, was invented 100 years ago, we were predominantly manufacturing economies where those products could be measured in units and measured at a customs house as they were being imported and exported. And now in an information economy, predominantly a services economy, that becomes increasingly difficult to measure. And so it's still being used as the primary yardstick by which politics is held to. But you're exactly right that there need to be greater measures of human development and human happiness and community development that should be used as the rubric by which we hold our legislators accountable. But I do think that at least what we're trying to build would be somewhat of a proxy to that, because what we're proposing is legislators should be held accountable to their own communities, the communities that sent them to Westminster or to Washington in the first place are the ones that should be holding them accountable to the results. And that's often been a real struggle. It's very difficult for people to understand what their legislators are even doing unless they make news by some scandal. They often don't really know even how they're voting on legislation that's in Parliament or in Congress. So what most people have told us is, aside from even the aspect of having a say in the process, they just like to be able to see what their legislator did, and how they voted on all the bills that in some cases don't get a lot of media coverage, because a lot of the marquee legislation takes up a lot of the oxygen from journalists. But there's hundreds of bills that get voted on in a given congressional session, many of which don't get a lot of airtime and have a tremendous impact on people's lives. Oftentimes, they won't see the results of that for many years going forward. So there should be a more, not only more direct, but more accountability for these policies that are being carried out. That seems to have been lost. This is another aspect, actually, that has resulted from local journalism mostly disappearing. It used to be that we would have beat reporters in every state capital or city hall, or the big newspapers would have local reporters covering politics at the local and state and federal level. Now a lot of that is really just centralized around the federal reporting, and most of them are even just getting their content from the Associated Press or Reuters. So everybody basically reports the same thing, and you don't get much of a flavor of whether or not my particular legislator is doing a good job, because nobody's really covering it anymore. So we're having to essentially rebuild a system of data driven accountability for legislators, as you say, to cover what has been lost from the lack of local journalism.
Point about the media is really important because local journalism has also collapsed here, and media ownership and power over public discourse is concentrated in the hands of a few, and it's mainly in the hands of private equity. So the control of the narrative is in the hands of a wealthy elite, and so that sets the priorities of the government rather than people and communities. And I also want to say that I think politics and economics are deeply intertwined, but our political class and our political system has tried to separate them and divorce them from each other. And now we've seen an economy that's completely financialized, where real economic activity and real industry is neglected in favor of financial speculation. So, what we really need to see is a recalibration of our political system so that we have control over our economy rather than outsourcing control to private corporations and to foreign interests. And that means ending the fallacy of central bank independence, because again, it's the same point that we are disempowering our politics and our communities and outsourcing it to bureaucrats. And that's part of the motivation behind Brexit as well, that caused so much discontent here and caused people to feel so disillusioned. And that's why they opted to pull the trigger over Brexit.
No, you're spot on. I mean, so coming originally to your point about corporate consolidation in the media, we just recently saw some pretty significant mergers here in the United States with Paramount and Warner Brothers. I mean, we're basically going to be in a situation where three or four billionaires own all of the news, and are basically all friendly to the administration. So what that means is that we're going to need to rely on people like you and others in independent media for actually being able to get the word out, because new and interesting ideas like what we're trying to do are not going to make it through the gauntlet of a corporate media system that is hostile to these types of changes. So that's one aspect. The point you mentioned about um, central bank independence. I mean, I think that um, and Brexit. Okay, so if we think about the motivating factors behind something like Brexit, there's the aspect, like you say, of this feeling that people have that they're not being the system is not accountable to their needs, and that the further the political system gets from me, the less accountable it becomes, right? So if I'm somebody sitting in Manchester, but the government is now effectively being run from Brussels, that feels like a further distance from me, and there's less accountability, and there's more layers of bureaucracy between me and that system of government, which you can even argue the European Union is not even directly a democracy anyway. It's more of a representation of the member states, right? And people will reflect that same type of feeling in the United States, where if I'm a person who lives in Denver, Colorado, Washington, D.C. is both physically distant from me, but also there are many layers between me and Washington, where I've got my city councilman who maybe I actually kind of know that person. I go to the meetings, I can see how they're performing. But then above that is I've got the state legislature, which I can potentially try to be involved in, or maybe I can sort of try to have an understanding of what they're doing. But then there's Washington, which is even further removed from me. So I've got these kind of layers of political groupings between me and the power that's held and vested in Washington. So I think that ideally everyone would love to have their government as local as possible, and I think that's where we see people really engaging in government is usually at the local level. And the further distant physically and theoretically that government becomes, the more disempowered people feel. And I think what this technology can do is bring that power back into their pockets in a way that makes them feel more centralized into the process. At least that is our ambition.
Finally, I want to finish by asking how we can actually bring about change like this and other change to our systems in the future. Should we pursue a way of bringing change that's incremental, like what we've seen with the Democrats and the Labour Party, trying to bring slow changes that compound over time over a 5 year period? Or should we be bold and bring radical change as quickly as possible, even if it means compromising on the quality of that change?
I feel like the radical change is already happening. The question here is that what are we going to get off the back of that process? Because I don't know that you could argue a more radical change in public policy than the MAGA movement represents in the United States. Um, the the question is, are we okay? So I think we need to come back to the basic premise here, which is that if people feel like democracy is accountable to them and is delivering for them, they will continue to believe in and invest in democracy. If they believe that democracy is no longer accountable to them, they will reject democracy as a concept, and they will fall in with dictatorship or with anarchy, basically no government at all. And we've already seen some of this happening when people are storming the Capitol on January 6th with the belief that they're going to topple the government and install effectively an authoritarian system. Or we had in Portland, we had essentially an anarchist group kick out the city government and run the government with no government, just take over the city and run the city in complete anarchy up until somebody got killed, and then the government came back in and reintroduced the police force in the city council. So we're already seeing, I think, this radical transformation happening. What we ought to be doing is giving people a constructive mechanism for creating the kind of change that they're looking for, so that we can prove to them that democracy can still deliver. And if democracy can still deliver, then they will reinvest in democracy. But if that radical change is happening one way or the other, we ought to just provide a more constructive mechanism to deliver it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. Please make sure to subscribe and follow. Thank you so much. Share this with your friends, share this with your family. This has been Mission Undercover, and I hope to see you all next time.